Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shiloh. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm the Affirming Ministries Coordinator of Edmonton, based on the Robertson Wesley United Church. Thank you for joining me today for my Affirming Reflections live stream. Today's topic, we're going to talk a little bit about the transition of behavior to identity in relation to homosexuality or same-gender relationships throughout history and throughout church life. So for folks who are watching, anyone in the chat, if you are able to kind of share a little bit about, what are some of the beliefs around homosexuality that people in your church understand, or people maybe in past churches that you attended. What are some of the beliefs that they have around homosexuality in general? And we're not going to touch anything about transgender or gender today, so we're just going to think about sexuality. So what are some of the views that they had? Have any of their views changed? And if so, what do they believe now? And also, if you are available to share a little bit about maybe what your beliefs are, and maybe kind of the transition from what you used to believe to where you are now in your theology around sexuality and human sexuality. So I'd love to see what some of you are believing now, and kind of some of the reasonings to how you got there. So feel free to throw those into the chat as I continue. Oh, and welcome, RW. So before I get going, I want to talk a little bit about what is sexual behavior. So sexual behavior refers to a very broad spectrum of behaviors. Mostly this is, we're thinking about obviously humans here, so this is how humans display sexuality. So there's different types of elements to it, such as biological elements. There's sometimes cultural influences that involve sexual behavior. It also ranges between, solitary actions such as masturbation, and it can be also included within partnered sex. So this can include intercourse, sexual oral sex, or any non-penetrative sex as well. Sexual behavior can also involve behavior that aims at arousing a desired partner. So this could be courtship, displays, or rituals. We don't normally see this anymore, but there are ways where we still do this. And as well as behavior aimed at enhancing sexual experiences. So this could be, foreplay, BDSM, other kinks, and things like that. So that's sexual behavior. So what is sexual orientation? So sexual orientation is the type of sexual, romantic, emotional, and or spiritual attraction one has the capacity to feel for others. So this is usually generally labeled based off of the gender of the folks that they're in relationship with. So certain sexual orientations can be lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, demisexual, things like that. So there are different aspects to sexual orientation, but again, it just is based off of the gender of the two people or multiple people in the relationship. So we talked about orientation and behavior. So what exactly is sexual identity then? So sexual identity is essentially how one thinks of themselves in terms of how they see themselves or understand their own sexuality or romantic attraction towards others. So sexual identity and sexual behavior are very closely related to sexual orientation as a whole, but all three of them are very distinguished. So identity refers to the individual concept of one's own self. Behavior refers to the sexual acts performed by that individual. And then sexual orientation refers to the romantic or sexual attractions towards person of the same, different, or more than one, or no gender at all. So those are the three kind of main aspects of behavior, orientation, and identity. So what is homosexuality? I just want to do a disclaimer here that I personally do not like the term homosexuality as a common term. The reason why I want to say homosexuality here in this context is because when we think about, being gay, being lesbian, being bisexual, being pansexual versus homosexuality, there's different connotations to it. Homosexuality feels very medical. It's definitely an outdated term. But when we talk about it in a religious or historical sense, I find homosexuality a, a better term to use to kind of understand the whole context behind where we're trying to go. Because when we think about history and we think about, the past, folks back then, they experienced and understood same-sexual intercourse, same-sex intercourse, same-gender relationships, completely different than we do now. And I find homosexuality depicts that better than me saying folks in the past were gay, because that's some of the language they wouldn't have used. And even homosexuality can only go so far as well, because even that term they didn't fully understand or use. And so I just want to be cautious that I am using the term homosexuality in a historical sense, not in a common sense, so please don't use that if you're referring to folks who are in the LGBTQ community now, but this is why I will be using this term. So homosexuality is defined as the romantic or sexual attraction, as well as the sexual behavior between members of the same gender. So this could be people who identify as male, people who identify as female, as well as folks who might both identify as non-binary or other genders. It's essentially just folks of the same gender in a relationship. Scientists do not know yet what causes homosexuality or other sexual orientations. Many theorize that it's a complex interplay of genetic, hormonal, environmental, and cultural influences, but almost all do not view it as a choice. So, although there's no single theory, or we still haven't found our gay gene yet, there is no essential single theory around sexual orientation. But most scientists favor a biological-based theory because there's just more evidence supporting it, and there's very little or lack of evidence supporting a social or cultural or education-based understanding. So there is more evidence towards a biological aspect, but some people still unfortunately see homosexuality as being unnatural, even though scientific research shows that homosexuality in itself is a normal and natural variation in human sexuality, along with many other animals within the kingdom of that we live in, that there are so many different animals as well that engage in homosexual behavior and acts. So what has the church thought around homosexuality? So we're going to jump into that a little bit. So homosexual relationships and acts have been admired as well as condemned throughout recorded history. So depending on the form they took and the culture in which they occurred, homosexual relationships and acts have been very, very different. So if we look at kind of prior to the rise of Christianity, certain sexual practices that are considered today to be considered homosexual existed along certain groups, mostly with a degree of social acceptance. So this would have been mostly ancient Rome and ancient Greek, where it was very common and normal for Greek men to have a pederastic relationship. So this would have been an adult Greek man, and he would have had a relationship or a sexual relationship with a young Greek boy, and as well as with in Rome, a Roman citizen would most likely have some sort of sexual slave partner, and that would have been also common. And again, that would have been normally same sex, just with fear of conceiving children at the time. So for both societies, they viewed anal sex as an act of dominance by the active partner. So this is the person that would be technically penetrating, whereas the passive partner was deemed not being dominated and was rather kind of a passive partner. And this also represents, technically in their societies, there was no distinction between it and how vaginal sex worked, or how it was viewed. So essentially, the person that had the power in the relationship was the person that was doing the penetrating. So it didn't matter where that penetration was happening or who it was to. The only thing that mattered was that you if you were a male in that society, you were only allowed to penetrate and not to be in the passive role, because a passive role would have been deemed a lower status, especially for women. Unfortunately, they were considered a passive role in sexual intercourse, and because of that, women were deemed lesser than or second-class citizens. And same with these slaves, and same with these pederastic relationships. These young men and slaves who were being dominated by Roman and Greek citizens, they were also seen as second-class citizens, and were oftentimes considered women in that relationship, which is why it was okay for men to have that active role, but there was a lot of stigma still to be in that passive role, and we kind of see that a little bit today in our societies, especially within male groups. We still see a lot of, hashtag no homo, and a lot of fear around male sexuality, and how men are perceived. If they are seen as very dominant, they're kind of seen as a very high status person, whereas we see a lot more feminine or femme type gay men having most of the stigma depicted towards them. And we see that as well if we look at kind of the translations around the Bible, and how homosexuality was translated from the Greek word that meant soft. This is in 1 Timothy. The Greek word literally means a soft man. And in English, we've translated that as homosexual, as if all people who are homosexual are soft men. So we're already still seeing a lot of this kind of social norms, and these roles that we play, still technically having a lot of stigma around men who are in the passive or in a quote-unquote feminine role, as we still live in a very misogynistic society. So since the end of the 20th century, we've seen a huge global movement towards freedom and equality for gay people. This includes the introduction of anti-gay bullying, legislation that protects gay children at school. We've seen legislation ensuring non-discrimination throughout the country, as well as even in the military. We've seen equal access to healthcare, although from a transgender perspective, I know we could talk about that in a whole other live stream. There's equal ability to adopt and to be a parent now. Mostly this is in Canada. Finally, we've established marriage equality. Canada's being, I think, the third country to do so, or the third or fourth. These states did it a few years ago. So we're starting to see social movements, mostly in the West. We still have a lot of countries in the Middle East and in lower mainlands in Africa and India, where a lot of these laws are still criminalized. And also there are many countries that still have being gay as a death penalty. So there's still so much more to go. But from a Canadian understanding and a Canadian standpoint, we've seen a huge increase in equality and freedom for gay and lesbian and bisexual and pansexual folks. So regardless of all of this movement that we've had in the last 20 years or so, we've seen that in cultures that are very influenced by Abrahamic religions. So Abrahamic religions would include Christianity, and in that Catholic. You would also include Islam, and you would also include Judaism. So those would be the three Abrahamic religions. And majority of the world are influenced by these three. You'll see more in Eastern religions, where they believe in a lot of different things when it comes around sexuality and gender, so that could be definitely a future live stream. So in cultures influenced by Abrahamic religions, the law and the church established sodomy as a transgression against divine law and a crime against nature. So many of you are probably like, well, what is sodomy? Sodomy is quite hard to define because it's been used in a variety of different ways, but the most common use of it is generally defined as any anal or oral sex between people, or any sexual activity between a person and a non-human. So this would be bestiality. but it's often not, sodomy is often not used for that anymore. But essentially sodomy is described as any non-procreative sexual activity. So sodomy can happen between, heterosexual folks, homosexual folks. Anyone can essentially engage in sodomy, but most of the time it is used to um, describe anal sex, especially between two men. So sodomy, you probably think, yes, it is considered from the story Sodom and Gomorrah. That's where the term sodomy comes from, which is in the book of Exodus, which was commonly used as anti-gay verses. A lot of folks took Sodom and Gomorrah as a way of kind of being like, aha, God punishes gay people. But most conservative and liberal theologians do not see Sodom and Gomorrah being a valid reasoning behind anti-gay rhetoric. So even folks who are still against LGBTQ identities don't even refer to Sodom and Gomorrah anymore. But unfortunately, the term sodomy still holds on. So sodomy laws in many countries still criminalize this behavior, and we see now in the Western world, many of these laws have been overturned, or we just don't even enforce them anymore. And the condemnation of anal sex between males still predates Christian belief, and it was very frequent in ancient Greece and in ancient Rome, as we said. And this idea of it being unnatural can even be traced back as far as Pluto. If we take a step back from Abrahamic understandings of law and church, in the social sciences, there's a dispute between essentialists and constructionists. And so essentialists typically believe that sexual preferences are determined by biological forces. So this would be just, gene makeup, hormonal makeup, kind of where you are in the world, stuff like that. Whereas constructionists assume that sexual desires are learned. So this could either be learned by parents, it could be learned by the culture and society around them, and it could also be learned by certain experiences that people go through as well. We even see all over the world, especially here in North America, we saw many indigenous peoples of Turtle Island before the colonization from Europe. We had, relatively common understandings of same gender sexuality, as around as even being third gendered, and this usually centered around two-spirit individuals. The term two-spirited was coined in 1990, but it's a generalized term to express this the spiritual and a tribal role that two-spirited people held in being this in-between of genders. And so during colonial times and colonization, unfortunately, European invasion completely wiped out a lot of these traditional roles, and many two-spirited people and many people who still at that time identified as homosexual were often persecuted, sometimes leading to death sentences and having charges of sodomy against them. So we see in many of those communities that homosexual individuals either escaped through engaging in heterosexual marriages or partnerships, or turning to religion and clergy to escape that public scrutiny of not being interested in the opposite sex at the time. So we see, even throughout history, colonization and Christianity forcing itself into all of these other cultures and all these other understandings of sexuality and completely wiping them. We see even in the early 1950s, if we look back in Western society and more recent modern history, the American Psychiatric Association published its first DSM-5, which is not the DSM-5, it would have been the DSM-1, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And in 1955, they included homosexuality as a disorder. It was almost immediately kind of scrutinized because it failed to hold up to any of the research that was funded by the Mental Health Institute of the time. It talked a lot about how there was no research that, shared that people would have had a rougher time, that they weren't able to engage in normal activities, that there was no kind of barriers for them being gay at all. But we do see that many of these changes happened later on. So in 1973, so about 20 years later, the DSM was changed and homosexuality was removed because, quote, it says, homosexuality per se implies no impairment in judgment, stability, reliability, or general social or vocational capacities. So it was finally changed and then removed from the DSM. So it's no longer considered a mental disorder. Following that, though, because of that history of people seeing homosexuality as a disorder, we see that there have been a huge influx of sexual orientation change efforts. That's kind of the term they like to call it. Many of you might know it familiar as conversion therapy. So this is essentially any type of form of trying to get someone's sexual identity, sexual orientation, or sexual behavior to change. So there is no studies of adequate scientific rigor that conclude that sexual orientation change efforts work to change a person's sexual orientation. These efforts have obviously been controversial due to the tensions between faith-based organizations and LGBTQ rights organizations, but as well as the influx of professional and scientific organizations that are starting to come in on this issue. We're even seeing that the American Psychological Association, quote, most people experience little or no sense of change about their sexual orientation, end quote. So some individuals and groups have promoted the idea that homosexuality is some sort of symptomatic and developmental defect, or some have even argued that it's a spiritual and moral failing, and argued that sexual orientation change efforts are important and need to happen, whereas, there is no major mental health professional organization that has sanctioned efforts to change sexual orientation, and almost every single one of them have adopted a policy stating that there is no correct way to go about changing someone's sexual orientation. So that's good to know that we have the backing of both science on our side. If we look now at religion, and kind of to tie everything together, especially with the topic of behavior to identity, or what does that even mean? And so, for me, the reason why I wanted to talk about this is that it helps me understand how folks understand homosexuality from a non-accepting lens. So, through relationships between homosexuality and religion is complex, there's a wide range of understanding. So we have folks who are very conservative that teach that homosexuality in itself is sinful. We have others that say, homosexual desire is sinful. Some other denominations state that the act is sinful, and then there's others that say that no, being LGBTQ is completely normal and is you're created and loved by God, and that is fully accepted. And so this is kind of what I wanted to talk about, is this change of understanding of behavior to identity. So we saw that in the past, when the church thought about homosexuality, they thought only of behavior. Because at that time, there was no such thing as sexual orientation. There was no such thing as sexual identity. The only thing that existed was sexual behavior. It was believed that everyone was straight. Again, they didn't have that term. It was believed that every person that had male genitalia identified as male and had a male role. People who had, vaginas were considered female and had female roles. And so things were very, very strict. And when it comes to relationships and when it comes to sex, it wasn't about, someone's sexual orientation. It was about, conceiving children. It was about consummating marriages. It was about creating families. And that was kind of the role that sex had. And so for them, it wasn't this, spiritual notion of, falling in love and having relationships. It was just a sexual act that people did to create children. But many societies found out that sex is fun and that there are ways to have sex without the fear of conceiving more children. And so that's why you saw in ancient Rome and in ancient Greek, a lot of these men who had wives and had children would often, go to the temple and have sex with some of the temple prostitutes there, who were unfortunately usually young boys. And then you had, all of these richer Roman and Greek citizens who had slaves that were men that they would then do that stuff with. And so because at that time, again, it wasn't about being gay or being straight, it was about where are you in the role of the act. And so like I mentioned before, it was about who was the active partner and who was the passive partner. So that's all it was about. It was about who was in charge and who had power rather than what was happening. And so when the church was starting to see this and Christianity started to erupt, there was a lot of issues around what does this mean for us as Christians? How do we follow this as faithful followers? What do we do? And so we see especially folks like Paul in the New Testament, and that's why Paul talks a lot about, that's why the last 3 verses around homosexuality come from Paul. Because Paul is very anti-sex. Paul says that, sex in itself is beautiful, but only within marriage, and even within marriage, it's a distraction. And so Paul's belief around homosexual acts, again, talk about this understanding of unnatural, but his understanding of unnatural, if you look at the original context in the original Greek, his notion of unnatural doesn't mean biological, right? So we're not talking about this ability to procreate. Paul's understanding of unnatural was around gender roles. Again, and that goes back to who was active and who was passive in that act. And so that's what Paul is referring to with his unnatural understanding. But we see now with English translations and this weird understanding and very modern, I guess, need for a literal read of the Bible. I personally do not read the Bible literally. That is my own understanding of biblical literature. But even if you look in ancient Christianity and even Judaism, it's very rare to read scripture in a literal sense, and it's actually quite a recent modern phenomena for denominations and churches to read it very literal. But we saw that huge rise in a literal understanding in the early 40s, 50s, 60s, and that's when we started seeing homosexuality being translated from Greek to English and it being thrown into those verses. So we saw originally the church condemned same-sex behavior. So this idea of having sex with other men, not so much because of the act itself being wrong, but because they were forcing other men to be in this passive role. And that's what they were trying to not do. It wasn't about being gay, it wasn't about the act itself, it was about making sure that other men were not put in that place of being a passive partner, because that was, unfortunately at that time, sorry women, but that was the woman's job. That was the woman's role, was to be that passive partner. And so to get men to be that passive partner was demoralizing and demeaning. And that's why, if we look at the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, for example, that's why the men of Sodom went up to Lot and said, let us have sex with the angels, because it was a form of war violence, because it was the number one way to demoralize another man. And so this is kind of where I bring in this idea of the integrity lens. And so this is a very theological understanding for many, many conservative Christians. And so this is the understanding that anything to do with same-sex behavior, anything to do with sexual orientation around same-sex behavior, and anything that has to do with same-sex identities, for them in this integrity lens, they believe all of that and everything to do with it is sinful. They believe if you are gay, if you're a lesbian, if you're bi, if you're pan, inherently sinful. If you act on those things, you're sinning. If you think about those things, you're sinning. So anything that you can do, you're just inherently sinful. It's very rare that churches view that now. There unfortunately still are some. But that was the original understanding of it. And this was the understanding of it mostly throughout our history within the last 20, 21st century. This is how they understood it. They understood homosexuality not as an orientation or as an identity, but rather as all of it combined just being a sinful act. And that's what they believed, and that's why we still have a lot of work to do even in our society with a lot of churches and with Canada in itself and North America being based on a lot of Christian fundamentals, that we're seeing a lot of these laws changing to include rights for LGBTQ folks, because at the time they believed that anyone who was gay was choosing to be, and that they were choosing sin, and that they were inherently sinful. If we look at the next lens, this one's called the disability lens, and this kind of goes hand in hand with the results of the DSM-5 or the DSM back in the 1950s, where they were including LGBTQ folks as being a mental disorder. This is when this, welcome Aaron, I see that you joined. We see that in this disability lens that churches started to shift their understanding of homosexuality. They started seeing a lot of these scientists saying that being LGBTQ is inherently a disability. And this kind of changed from where churches believed that you chose to be gay, that any act that you do is sinful, and that you are sinful. Now with all of these incurrence with science, including LGBTQ as being a disability, that was no longer a valid argument for the church, and they started seeing pushback with it. And that's why a lot of churches changed their theology, because apparently that's what they like to do, is they change it. But then they also, a lot of churches, I would say, still believe in this lens, where it's now no longer inherently a sin, but that if you act on it, it's a sin. So this is a lot of conservative folks you might like this. A lot of them say like being gay is a result of the fall. So they'll say like being a homosexual is inherently not sinful because you can't choose it. Hence the term disability lens. So disability, what they're saying is that it's not something that's a choice, but rather a failing. And so for them, they see homosexuality. Oh, Avery, hello, welcome. I didn't see that you're here. I can't see names on who's viewing, but I can see who comments, so welcome. We can see the disability lens showing that, it's okay to be gay. You didn't choose to be gay, but if you act on being gay, then that's where the sin comes in. And so we've seen this huge shift in the last 50 to 40 years of it being inherently to now only the action being. And this is kind of where a lot of churches are sitting with homosexuality now. If we move on to the last lens, which is where I sit, which is the diversity lens, this is where a lot of churches, like some of the Lutheran denominations, we're starting to see it a little bit more with the Anglican churches. We see it obviously with the United Church and the United Church of Christ in the States, that these are congregations and denominations that fully affirm and welcome LGBTQ folks. And they believe that being homosexual is a natural variance in human identity, and that is created and supported and celebrated by God, and no ifs, ands, or buts. And so we have these three lenses that the church has gone through. All of churches have gone through this, and there's some that are stuck on different phases. And we're starting to see a lot of them, starting to shift their understandings. And we see a little bit as well, if you ever get a chance to read the book God and the Gay Christian by Matthew Vines. I will share on the Affirming Ministries page a YouTube link of his kind of discussion before he wrote the book. It's about an hour long, really informative. He has been a great advocate and ally around being, he's a gay man. He was a Christian for all of his life, and he's really spearheaded a lot of this stuff about 10 years ago. And in his book, he breaks that down, these lenses a little bit, and breaks down the church's logic, I guess, around being LGBTQ. Because the reasoning behind for him is he states that being LGBTQ, the church has shifted from it being inherently sinful from the integrity lens to now being this disability, and that if we act on it, then it's inherently sinful. And what Matthew Vines does is he takes all of the verses that are clobber passages, so we have the three in the Old Testament, the three in the New, and he pretty much states that all of these verses have nothing to do with same gender loving relationships that we see today. And that's why I did that disclaimer about the term homosexuality, because when we think about gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual people, we're thinking of people who have this identity and engage in relationships through choice and through being in relationship with. Whereas back when the Bible was written and when a lot of these laws were enforced, we were at a time where marriage was forced. It was, it was predetermined. It was not meant for loving relationships. It was a ways of connecting family ties together and creating war bonds. And so we're starting to see that, this idea behind, if you act on it, you're not allowed to get married, you're not allowed to do any of that stuff. And Matthew Vine really breaks it down, especially when it comes to this idea of celibacy, where a lot of these churches are saying, no, if it's okay to be gay, that's not something you can choose, but you can't act on it. So because you can't act on it, the only thing you can do is be celibate for the rest of your life. And Matthew Vines does a really great job of breaking that down and saying how, Paul, who is very, very anti-sex, who celebrates the idea of celibacy, Paul even states, if you cannot handle that lust or that need or that desire for companionship, for sex, for marriage, then to do so. He says celibacy is not to be forced on people. Celibacy is a gift from God, and that only a select few are gifted with that ability to be celibate and to focus solely on God. And so Matthew Vines pretty much just breaks it down and says forcing gay people to be celibate just because of a few verses is inherently going against everything that the Bible states. So if you ever get a chance, please read it. And if you don't want to read the book, I'll link the video in the comments and as well as on the Affirming Ministries page. But yeah, so that's a little bit about what I wanted to share with you today. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me a chat or just to post it on the comments here, and I can definitely answer them throughout the day. But that's essentially kind of what I wanted to share around behavior to identity. I think it's really important to know that when we're looking at the context of, the clobber passages, that we can't look at them with a lens of, identity and sexual orientation that we do now. That we have to view it in a way that it's, at that time, it wasn't seen as an inherent, natural phenomenon. It was at that time just seen as a way of, acting upon a certain urge, and it wasn't seen as a certain identity, but rather a behavior. And so to see that the churches have gone from, seeing it as a behavior to now disability to now many of them celebrating it is a really great change. And I think we've got obviously a lot more work to do, but to just be proud of the work that we have done. And yes, Aaron, yeah, totally. It's true. You see so many of these verses and a lot of the theology that people who are anti-LGBTQ are spewing, and a lot of them go against a lot more of the Bible. If you look at, the idea of good fruit and bad fruit, that's in the Bible quite a bit, whereas, homosexuality is referenced barely 7 times. And that's if you even want to consider it homosexuality. as well, right? Like if we look at, the Clobber Passage, which I've done a few live streams on, so if you ever are interested, go check those out. But essentially, every uh, verse in the Clobber Passages have nothing to do with homosexuality as we know it today. It has only to do with same-sex behavior that is, again, not loving, not, a part of what we know now. It was, again, economic induced, it was forced, it was, usually rape, it was usually very harsh, non bad fruit, essentially. That's what those were. And then it has nothing, and it does not reflect on homosexuality and same-gender relationships that we know today. So, yeah, so thank you all for joining. If you have any questions about what I shared today, and if you have any live stream topics that you'd like me to touch on, if there's anything that I've been missing that you haven't seen me speak about and want to hear my opinion, please let me know in the chat if there's anything that you'd like me to kind of share a little bit on. Now I can definitely repeat topics too if there was a topic that I didn't go too far in depth with that you'd like me to go further. Please again let me know. But yeah, so thank you all for joining me. I do this Affirming Reflections live stream every third Monday of the month. So next live stream is going to be April 19th. I don't know the topic for that one yet. It's written down somewhere, so I'll definitely update you all on that. And if you are free throughout the week, I do host a online Affirming Coffee Hour, which is on Thursdays at 11. If you do want to join us, it's a drop-in time, so feel free to join us right at 11 or drop in anytime and leave anytime. It's just an hour for folks to kind of check in, relax, chat with us, ask questions, and hang out. So please join me for that on Thursday if you are available, and if not, I will see you at the next Affirming Ministries Affirming Reflections live stream next month. And if you have any chance to chat with me or to go for coffee, please feel free to send me a message and I can definitely do that. So take care, everyone. Thank you all for joining, and I will see you next time. Thank you.